Hello, my name is Ashley Sanguino with the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program. Today is July 11th of 2023, and I'm interviewing Frency Moore at the Pensacola Library in Pensacola, Florida. If you could please introduce yourself, what is your full name, and could you please spell it?
Sure. My name is Frency Ramos Moore, F-R-E-N-C-Y-R-A-M-O-S, Moore, M-O-O-R-E.
Perfect. So if we could get started with when and where were you born?
Okay, I was born in Brazil, actually the city of Vitória, Espírito Santo. Mm-hmm. That's a small state right under Rio de Janeiro. And I was born in February 29th, 1984. So almost 40 years ago.
Perfect. So what were your parents' names? When and where did they grow up? And do you have any siblings?
Okay. My dad's name was Renato, mm-hmm. and he was German descent. And my mother's name was Celia, mm-hmm. and she was Portuguese and indigenous from the Amazon. And I do have a younger brother. His name is Yuri, like the Russian astronaut. Mm-hmm. I don't know why. But my name, the interesting fact is my name is Frency, which means F for Filia, which means daughter in Portuguese. And R-E-N is Renato, which is my dad's name. And C-Y is Celia, which is my mom's name.
Wow.
So they made that up.
That is a very creative way of making a name.
Yes.
Okay, so what was it like growing up in Brazil? How long did you live there?
So my mom and dad were high school sweethearts, and right after high school they dated for 5 years, and they had me, and then they decided to get married, mm-hmm. and then they were pregnant with my brother, and then they got divorced. Mm-hmm. So my mom actually was a single mom. That's the life that I remember growing up, living in a 2-bedroom house, probably about 800 square feet. That would be my guess. And there was my mom, my brother, me, my grandmother, and a bunch of cousins, and aunts and uncles. So there was 8 of us in an apartment in Rio de Janeiro. Mm-hmm. So.
Okay. So were there any chores or responsibilities divided up in the household? You know, it sounds like you had a lot of people living in the house. So what was it like, in that dynamic?
So my grandmother was also a single mother when my mom was growing up, and even before in South America was, normal to be a single mom or a divorced parent. She worked full-time, which it was also unusual for that era. But I think my mom grew up in a household that empowered women in education. My grandmother had a master's degree in nutrition, so mm-hmm. she worked for a public hospital system in Rio de Janeiro. And so my mom went to school as well, and she was a kindergarten teacher. So I remember we all worked, we all had jobs, and but on the weekends I remember waking up to the sound of my grandmother cooking in the kitchen and listening to the news radio. So I do know she was in charge of making all the meals. Like, I don't remember ever my mom cooking or anyone else in the house, but we all had to clean up afterwards. So my brother and I had to go downstairs to get the newspaper. We were in charge of walking to the store to get, chicken or eggs or milk or whatever it was that needed to be taken care of, washing cars, stuff like that.
Yeah. So you mentioned how you were taught a lot about the importance of education and getting an education. Did you go to college, and if so, what did you study?
So when I was 14 years old, well, let's back up. When I was in second grade, I listened to a radio ad that talked about applying for the green card lottery in America. And so I told my mom about it. And so she actually applied. And so I don't really know all the logistics of it now, from this perspective, but I do know at the time I guess the United States government would, maybe it was a lottery, maybe it was at random, maybe not, but they granted 1,000 green cards to people in different areas of the world, depending on maybe race or their professional background. I know at one time they looked for like dentists or lawyers or whatnot, but so when I was in 8th grade, we actually were awarded a green card. So when I was 14 years old, we sold everything we owned in Brazil and we moved to America, to Pensacola. And that was my mom's whole entire motivation, was that my brother and I could attend college here. Because in Rio de Janeiro, all the universities are public, or at least the good ones are, but it's very difficult to get in. Like, you take a test and 1 out of 1,000 people would be able to attend. So even though I felt like both my brother and I had an advantage academically, it was very unlikely that we would move out of, the low middle class status that we were in. So she thought if we moved here, she could make a sacrifice and my brother and I can attend college. So long story short, I did go to the University of West Florida, which is here in town, and I got an undergrad degree in hospitality and resort management. And my brother also attended the University of West Florida and got a degree in art. Then he went on to go to FAMU and got a master's degree in architecture. And I became a school teacher.
It's amazing. So you mentioned how you moved just at 14. What was that process like, and how was it different living in Pensacola and the adjustments compared to, Brazil? That's a very different change.
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. So we had been to Miami and Orlando before, like to, Disney World. Like, I feel like it's a rite of passage for a Brazilian person to go to Disney World. Like, it's a thing. So in my mind, when my parents said we were moving to Florida, I imagined Miami. And then my parents found Pensacola because they wanted to live in Florida because of the weather, but we couldn't afford to live in Miami or Orlando because it was very expensive, like the cost of living there. So we kept going up the map. Like, we thought, okay, well, what about Gainesville? Okay, it's still too expensive and they don't have a beach. So let's move, to Tallahassee. And then we kept moving and we found Pensacola. Someone had mentioned that the cost of living here was affordable, and then there was the beach. So we're like, oh, sounds like a perfect place. And then we got here and it was nothing like Miami. And a really small town. Like, if you had been in, you guys are all probably too young, but Pensacola 25 years ago was nothing like it is today. Like, there was no diversity at all. Like, there was no other restaurants besides like Golden Corral and Walmart. Like, there was nothing that would make people excited, like today's people excited about living here. So it was a culture shock. in a lot of ways was really cool, because in Rio de Janeiro it's like a very big city and violent in ways. Like we have all sorts of human trafficking and drug trafficking. So you always have to be paying attention where you're going, what bus you're riding, what subway you're getting into. And then here, it was like you can leave your car door unlocked and it was fine, like no big deal. So in that way, we really liked it. But then going to school here, and like no one that I met at Pensacola High School knew where Brazil was located in the map. Most people made an assumption that we spoke Spanish, so no one really knew about our culture or were interested in learning about our culture. So that part was kind of sad.
I was wondering if, now is there any stronger sense of a community, Latinos or Brazilians in specific?
Yes, I think so. So once I got married and had kids, that was kind of like my goal. Like I would like to raise them in Pensacola, but I would like to raise them in a diverse community or to the best of our ability here in Pensacola.
Yeah.
And we have found a lot of friends that are from different countries. We have found lots of friends that speak Spanish and friends from Brazil specifically. I don't know that it is as exciting as it would, like I love going to Miami. Because you can literally eat all of the different foods from all of the countries, basically. Like you can travel the world without leaving one city. You don't have it here yet. But any chance that I have to encourage someone to open a new business or to share their culture, like we started a cultural day at my kids' school. So that way we get to taste foods and learn something new about a different, even if it's not Latin American, but anytime there's a new student that is diverse, we're like, share about you. And so it's much better than it was 20 years ago, for sure.
Yeah, and you mentioned attending the University of West Florida. Was that different from your experience growing up in Pensacola, where UWF was more diverse or more open-minded?
Yes, I loved it. So when I started high school here, it was terrible. I had a really hard time making friends. I didn't connect with a whole lot of my classmates or teachers. I felt like I didn't learn a whole lot, to the point where in my senior year, I had told my mom that I wanted to move back to Brazil. But I played a lot of sports. So when I was a senior, the track and field coach from UWF contacted me. And so that was like the turning point where I was like, okay, maybe I can go to a university here. And I toured it and I met lots of really neat people. So when I went to UWF, my first year, it was like night and day, a completely different experience, because there were so many diverse friends there. And I felt like the university made a point to make it more welcoming to all sorts of people. So yes, thank you for asking that, because it was true. Like I felt like, okay, I love college. I did not like high school, but I do love what I'm experiencing here.
Yeah, of course, thank you. Also, this is Rey Arcenas. I'm also with the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, and we have another interviewer here with us today.
Hi, my name is JoAnn Almonte. So going back to Brazil, you mentioned the violence, and I know that you left when you were around the age of 14, but when you moved here, did you keep in touch with like the political events that were happening in Brazil? How did that affect you and your family?
So yes, we did keep up with the political status, what was going on in Brazil, but I would probably say it's sort of from a bias perspective because my parents were very conservative in nature. So maybe what I remember being narrated in my home maybe was not really what was going on overall. But yes, my parents kept, because my mom in particular, she didn't learn English as quickly as my brother and I did. So going back to Brazil on a regular basis was sort of her goal. So she obviously wanted to know what was going on there. And then the fact that all of our family still lived in Brazil. So.
And when you made those trips with your mom, correct?
Not a lot of them. Mm-hmm. I maybe went back to Brazil once. Well, twice. Once as a teenager after we moved here, and then the second time when I was engaged, because I wanted my family to meet my husband, my future husband, and I wanted him to know what he was getting into because he's American. So that was the second time, and even since then I haven't been back.
Is there any specific reason you haven't gone back to Brazil?
Well, when I was a teenager, because it was expensive. Mm-hmm. So we took turns. Like my mom went 1 year, and then I have a stepdad. He went another year, and then I went 1 year, and then my brother went 1 year. And then when I got married, I went, and then my husband and I had 4 kids. And then we just have not been able to afford it.
Yeah,
it's expensive.
No, I completely understand. How old are your children?
So my oldest is 14. She's going into high school this year. And then I have a 13-year-old boy who's in 8th grade, and a 12-year-old girl who's going into 6th grade. And then my youngest is a 10-year-old boy.
Have you taught them a lot about Brazilian culture, and have they learned Portuguese?
They all speak Spanish, actually.
Oh, wow.
Because so when I was in college, I thought I would never get married because there's no way to assimilate. Family is really important in Brazil. And I thought, if I bring an American husband to this hot mess, there's no way, it's not gonna work. And no one in my family speaks English besides my younger brother. So when I met my husband, he's actually from Pensacola, mm-hmm. but he speaks Spanish fluently. So I thought, oh, well, this could work, because he lived in Ecuador for many years, or not for a little while. And so when we started having kids, we thought, okay, we can speak Spanish to them. That way, when they have a chance to go to Brazil, it would be a much closer than just speaking English. So they do speak Spanish.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
No, that makes perfect sense. Of course, I don't speak Portuguese, but I can get around with talking Spanish. So
yeah, and they attend a school that they take Spanish every day, and then when they graduate in 8th grade, they have to take the national Spanish exam. Mm-hmm. And so my 2 older ones have already passed that.
Okay, that's awesome.
So going to school and being able to learn there, how to write and read in Spanish as well.
Yeah.
That's been really helpful.
Especially in Florida now with so many Latinos coming in, there's restaurants that'll just speak to you in Spanish. So It definitely is a relevant tool to have.
That's how we started. We'd go eat at a Mexican restaurant here in town, and I would tell them, I'm not helping you. And if you don't speak Spanish, I'll tell the waiter, don't bring them the food.
Yeah.
Only if they order in Spanish.
Yeah.
And that's how, as young kids, that's when they were like, oh, okay.
I was the same way. My parents would just tell me, like, no te entiendo, I don't understand
Yeah.
until you speak. But yeah, changing gears a little bit, you'd mentioned a lot about, one of the main differences between Brazil and America was this less security and, a bit more violence in Brazil. Of course, that's an experience that is quite common throughout Latin America, and, unfortunately in some places has only gotten worse. A lot of people that study Latin American movements and whatnot will associate this to a weak rule of law, that, in Latin American countries, there's just not the same sort of respect towards, law and order. So, I can liken it in my experience as a Venezuelan American that, while somebody might see or witness a crime occur, they can't count on the police to actually do anything about it. So I was wondering if you have any experiences or what it was like in Brazil, having to live with that reality.
Yeah, actually, I told my kids the story the other day, but when I was in kindergarten, my mom was the kindergarten teacher. So when she had to go to school earlier than I did and then leave after. So my grandmother would catch the bus with me and drop me off at school on her way to work. And so I remember being 5 years old, being in the bus was full, and we are looking out the window and there's this girl standing at the bus stop with a purse. And this guy runs by it and like snatches her purse. And my grandma is like, oh no. So she tells the bus driver to stop the bus. She gets off the bus and she starts hitting this guy with her purse. And so other people come out of the bus and get him on the ground, and she's like hitting him with her purse, and then snatches the little girl's purse back and gives it back to her, and we all get back in the bus and we go to school. And I don't remember thinking anything of it, just that my grandma is tough. I was like, geez, I wouldn't want to steal anything from my grandma. But now thinking back as an adult, I'm like, yeah, that was the mentality. Like, if we don't get that purse back right now, this little girl's never going to see her purse again. And so it's almost like you have to know self-defense, and you have to create justice for yourself. And especially being a woman, and you just have to be tough. There's no other way around it. Yeah. As an adult now, thinking of all the things that I believe today is probably from growing up and,
Yeah. So growing up, did you ever feel a pressure to assimilate to sort of the wider American culture? Or were you more of I'm refuse to assimilate, I'm going to be who I am in defiance of that?
So that's a interesting question, because when I first moved here, I think I mentioned I played a lot of sports. I played basketball, I ran track and field, and in cross country. And a lot of my friends were African Americans. The school that I attended, Pensacola High School, have the IB program, which is mostly white and Asian kids. And then everyone else at school is African American. And so when I started playing sports for my high school, and all of my teammates were African American, because the IB kids were they were drowning in homework, so they actually didn't do any sports, I guess. And so I just remember loving all of my African American friends, and I couldn't relate to any of the white kids at the school. So no, I didn't feel pressure to fit in with the white kids. I just wish that the kids that were my friends knew more about my culture. Does that make sense? Yeah.
And I haven't stopped thinking about when you said create justice for yourself in reference to the story that you told your children. Is that kind of community protection kind of integral to to living in Brazil? And have you learned to build upon community building here in Pensacola?
Yeah, like that's been like sort of my understanding of life, you know, like you live in community. Like that was one of the things that I thought it was strange about Americans. Like people didn't know their neighbors. And I remember like everybody that lived in my neighborhood was my cousin. Like, you know, like, oh, this is my cousin, you know, Maria. No, she's not really my cousin. She just grew up in the same neighborhood that I did. And so yes, community has always been an important part of who I am, and I try to, you know, have it here too.
And in what ways have you tried to build up those community, like collectivized events and feelings?
I'm very active in my neighborhood association. I talked my husband into running for political office. He's the representative for our district in the city of Pensacola. And then anything that has to do with advocating for children, because I'm a school teacher, I have a background in education. I was in the classroom for 10 years. I'm now an administrator, but anything in our community that has to do with advocating for children, if I know someone that's personally involved in that cause and they need assistance, I try to assist in that as well.
And what are some of those pressing causes that are currently at this point in time very important and on the radar for you?
Well, one of the things most recently that I've helped work on, it's in Escambia County, only 42% of our students are ready for kindergarten as they enter the public school system. And that was a very alarming number. It's a very low number for Florida, but especially for this area, it's the lowest that's ever been. So collectively with a nonprofit organization that I'm closely related with and a couple friends, we've started like different programs that educate parents on the importance of like reading to their babies, singing songs to their babies, making sure that they are exposed to a lot of words, even if it is in Spanish. Like we have a big Spanish population in Pensacola, and to say like, you know, read to your child in Spanish, talk to them, sing to them, so their brain will be well developed, so they'll be ready for kindergarten.
Yeah, tell us more about that nonprofit, like its name, its history, if you can share that.
Yeah, this particular organization is called Studer Community Institute. It was started by Quint Studer. He's the owner of the Wahoos. He also owns a couple other businesses in town, but it started in the motion that it's really hard to find well-qualified workers in this area. So he started looking at high school graduation rates, which at the time was like 10 years ago when he started this nonprofit, was at 66%. Only 66% of our students in Pensacola, Florida graduate from high school. And so he started to implement some programs there, and he thought it really is not making any difference. So let's move on to middle school. Can we do any, efforts to help our middle school students? And the numbers were about the same. 66% were actually passing, the reading comprehension tests. The more research that they did, they got together with the University of Chicago and then Harvard University, and he started to learn more about early brain development to say, okay, well, if a parent knows that education is important, they'll put an effort into making sure their child is ready for kindergarten, and then that, eventually correlates to a successful academic life, therefore creating better, adults that can actually be productive in the workplace. So that's sort of how it started. They've been around for 8 years. But one particular program that I was really involved in is called the Brain Bag Program, where they go into the hospitals and volunteers talk to the parents right after the mom has had a baby. And they show them a video, they give them a gift, a reading book, and they'll say, like, you know, it's really important. You know, it may sound silly when you talk to a baby and they don't talk to you back, but you're actually developing your baby's brain, and it will help them be ready for kindergarten.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a whole lot of sense in terms of making sure parents are prepared to be able to prepare their children. So sort of similar in that same right or thought, in your perspective as an educator, how are Brazilian parents' mindsets towards schooling different than what your experience has been as an educator in Pensacola?
Yeah, so I feel like as I remember growing up, maybe because my mom was a teacher and my grandmother was a single mom, so education was really important in order for them to be able to provide to us. But I just remember always thinking education comes first. Mm-hmm. But I do think it's meeting other Brazilians that it's a mindset. Because, like I said, it's very difficult to get into universities in Brazil, and there's, I guess, unless you're a famous soccer player, there's no really other way to move from one social class to another, unless you're really well educated. So that's always, as far as I remember, education was always really important compared to my experience here as a teacher, as a kindergarten teacher, is not the same. I think it's an opinion, I know, but I think a lot of people in America take education for granted because it's free, or because it's always been there, or because they don't really think that it's necessary in order to succeed. I don't know, but I see a lot of parents that are not as involved that they should be in the early ages. So
yeah, this is also going back a little bit concerning something that you had mentioned with how your family decided on Pensacola. You had mentioned, of course, affordability, but also the beach. How is like nature and, the landscape of Brazil affected like how you see America and, what you enjoyed about it in Brazil?
Yeah. The weather so I'm from Rio de Janeiro, which there's no winter or summer. It's like hot all the time, except in the winter it rains. So that's the only difference. And so people are outside all the time. Like, I don't remember ever sitting at home watching TV. Like, that was not part of my childhood at all. Like, one neighborhood kid had a bicycle, and then we all ran behind him. Or like, if you're the lucky one that gets to be, on the handlebar while he's riding the bike, that's cool too. Or eating fruit from trees outside. Like, there was no inside. Like, maybe we had a TV, but I don't remember. Like, we watched the news at nighttime. So when we moved here, we liked that there is the beach, because obviously, I don't know if you guys know, Rio de Janeiro is like Copacabana is really famous, but there's like a whole stretch of beach in Rio de Janeiro, and we're famous for Mardi Gras Carnival. And so I guess the only difference is what people wear here versus in Brazil. But yes, being outside was really, really important to us. So being able to go to the beach, the white sand here was like very cool. Like, we had never seen that before. The sand in Rio is like dark, like from a river, so it's like brown. Now when I look at pictures of Rio, I think, like, why is the sand dirty? Because I'm used to the white sands here. But yes, being outside and being able to be in Pensacola where the weather is good, maybe half of the year is really important.
And you mentioned that, to jump around again, that people didn't tend to know a whole lot about Brazilian culture. What are some things that you feel like people still might misunderstand about current Brazilian culture or politics or things of that sort?
So I don't think, well, I've met like I said, Pensacola is growing and we're becoming more diverse and more educated. So maybe not as much as in the past, but I would say most people that I would meet did not know that we spoke Portuguese versus Spanish, or to say like, you know, like I would always say, well, did you know almost half of Latin America doesn't speak Spanish? And they were like, what? Like, no way. Like, I guess in people's minds, because of lack of education or understanding of geography, like they thought everybody spoke Spanish in Latin America or South America. And then I guess culturally speaking, I felt like here there's a big division in race. Like you identify as you know, African American, you're black or you're white or you're Asian, and that was weird for me because I don't think people understand that in Rio de Janeiro or in Latin America in general, there's a lot of mixed races. So it's very hard to say like I'm black. You know, like none of my friends were like looking at them, I don't think that I would be able to say like, oh, you must be 40% European and 60% black. You know what I mean? Like there was no way to know that. And I think that people here don't understand that concept. So does that make sense?
No, that does. Speaking more to Brazil, when you were growing up there, what were some of the things that your mother, your grandparents, your dad may have told you about the political landscape of Brazil? Were you informed about that at a young age? Did they speak about it at all?
Yeah. So one of the things I thought it was really interesting when I moved here was in world history in high school. They talked about dictatorship in Latin America and how terrible it was. And I went home and I was like, Grandma, like, I thought you said it was cool. Like, my grandmother said when she was growing up, they were so poor, they didn't have food or, you know, and so there was a dictatorship in Brazil very briefly, and she was like, everybody had food. It was great. Like, she said maybe that wasn't what everybody wanted, but for the time being, because the majority of people didn't have anything, to just have health care and education and a guaranteed plate of rice at your house was better than nothing, you know? So she said it was very brief and it worked for her family. And then at some point they were able to like vote for a president. But she was like, I don't remember being terrible. I remember being awesome. So that was interesting to me to, you know, then like learning about Argentina and Eva Perón. Like lots of people in Argentina that I know of have fond memories of the Perón family. So, but here in America, all I heard was like, they were terrible, dictatorship, and so that to me is interesting. I don't know, I wasn't alive then, so but it's funny to me to hear both sides of the story.
Yeah, and what do you think would account for the difference in response to those two things, and to the reactions to such political organization?
Yeah. I think if you don't have anything, then a little bit sounds better than nothing. And then also, if you don't know any different, then you don't have anything to compare. You know, I think, like, I think in a lot of ways Americans take for granted the freedom that we have, that capitalism and democracy is powerful, but other people have never experienced that, so they don't know. You know, I'm an American now. I wouldn't want any different. I want to vote for my president. I want to have a say on what goes on in our political views, and I don't want a dictatorship or a monarchy. But I can also see I also know what it's like to have nothing. I also know what it's like to live in poverty. And you can't, it's like, you can't go from 0 to 100. Like, there's gotta be a process of building a healthy government. And maybe it starts as something that resembles prosperity. And because you don't know any different, then that is the best you've ever seen. And then maybe it evolves itself into democracy, because then you say, well, I don't agree with your political views, so now I would like to have a say in it, and then it becomes democracy? I don't know. You guys are the experts.
So sort of in a similar vein, I was wondering what your perspective was, if you've kind of been updated or kept in touch about President or previous President Bolsonaro. I know there was a lot of issues concerning him trying to obtain re-election and claims of election fraud and a similar insurrection of the Capitol, I believe, that parallels very similarly to what we've experienced here in the U.S. in 2016. So I was just wondering, what were your thoughts on that, especially being here in the United States and having sort of, just gone through that sort of similar process?
Yeah. So that's always been a joke in my home, is that in Brazil, we're like 5 years behind America, and we're just like wannabe Americans. When I was growing up, we didn't have a Walmart, or there was one McDonald's in the whole town. And now there's McDonald's everywhere in Brazil. There's Walmarts everywhere in Brazil. There's Coke everywhere. So this political mirroring is almost like it's kind of funny, because we're Brazilians, we love America, and we just want to be just like America.
Yeah, so this is sort of this is sort of different actually, but it just kind of came up with the mention of you explaining how you taught your children Spanish, and also kind of the challenge that you faced in being able to assimilate your husband sort of to your Brazilian family. I was wondering, what does speaking Portuguese mean to you, and how does that help connect you better to, your culture and whatnot? And what is your relationship with, speaking in Portuguese?
Yeah. I kind of feel sad when I think about it, honestly, because I feel that I didn't get to become very proficient writer, reader in Portuguese, because I left in 8th grade. And then that I didn't get my full education here in the United States in English. So in a lot of ways, I'm not really a proficient writer and reader in English. And then Spanish, very similarly, like I studied Spanish here and I was exposed to Spanish in Latin America, but I'm not really a proficient reader or writer of Spanish either. So when I really think about it, like I've lived here half of my life and I can speak 3 languages, but I'm really none of those really well. So part of me feels sad that I don't really feel like I have an identity, like in a language that I'm a master in. But then part of me thinks like maybe that's just how it is to be bilingual or what is the word, polyglot.
Yeah.
Is that you don't really master any of them unless you really spend a lot of time in it. But when I speak Portuguese, so my grandmother is still alive and she only speaks Portuguese, and she's really the only one now that I will speak Portuguese with. Sometimes I forget words and it makes me sad. But my goal is to take all 4 of my kids to Rio, and so that they can be immersed in the language and hopefully they'll carry it on to the next generation.
No, I think that's a very common experience with most immigrants, of not just in the language aspect of, the struggles of, especially coming at 14, you'd already gained like a grasp of Portuguese to then, be kind of thrown into English and whatnot, and now Spanish. So I think that's a very common experience shared around immigrants in terms of, again, not just like a language level, but also identity as a whole, being spread across from Brazil and the United States. So I was wondering, beyond as well as taking your kids back to Brazil, what are some other ways that, you try to connect to your culture and stay rooted with, your Brazilian background?
Yeah. I would say probably until I went to UWF. So from 14 to 18, I tried to hide that I was an immigrant, right? Like I wanted to fit in. So I guess I did try to fit in. Maybe not per se with the white America, but I wanted to fit in. So like I didn't want my mom to come to any of my high school basketball games because I didn't want people to know that I was an immigrant. So it wasn't until I went to college and I started to be around people that valued a diversity that I was like, oh, maybe it would be cool to be different. And then, of course, since I've gotten married and had kids, that's been a big goal of mine to, make sure that the Brazilian in us doesn't die. So we often cook Brazilian food. My grandmother I'm a terrible cook, by the way, but she has taught us how to make rice and beans and feijoada and like some more traditional Brazilian food. So that's one way we keep it alive. Anytime there's a new Brazilian singer that has like a more cultural, like Brazilian influence, we try to listen to the music. And then most importantly is follow up with soccer. Like we have to watch every World Cup and we have to know what's going on. Those are, I would feel like, the 3 biggest ways, but.
Yeah. So you had also mentioned, of course, and it's sort of seemed like a common theme throughout a lot of your answers concerning just how much you value equity and inclusion and celebrating these cultures, you know. I say equity and inclusion in specific because DEI, as you probably know as an educator, has been under attack a lot, especially in higher education here in the state of Florida. So I was wondering, just, you know, with your experience of being able to value your culture and seeing how that can help you grow as a person, how does that make you feel in terms of seeing that being controlled in education?
Right. I think it's really important to be able to learn history from different perspectives. Like, there is no, like, even in personal history, like, you know, if I say, this is my mom passed away recently. So my brother and I sat together and we went through, with NPR actually, and talked about our immigration story. And his perspective of our immigration, my brother's perspective of our immigration story was different than mine. He was younger than I was. He experienced things differently than I did. And I think that's true for world history, for national history, that there is more than one perspective. And so unless you're willing to hear the story from someone else's perspective, you're not learning really, because you're only seeing things from one side. So it makes me really sad to think that when my kids go to college, they're not gonna see education from a full picture. I don't like it. I wish that.
Yeah. Could you elaborate a little more on, you know, you mentioned that your brother and you had very different experiences with immigration. Could you elaborate a little more on that?
Yeah, so I'll give you an example. I always say, you know, when we won the green card lottery, our family sold everything we owned in Brazil and then moved here. And that's sort of like my full, like, big picture story of what happened. And in his detailed telling of him packing his bag, because my mom said, you can only bring one bag, like, you pack whatever you want in this one bag. Well, I didn't remember that part because I was a teenage girl. Like, I was looking forward to coming to Orlando and, like, going shopping. I didn't care what I brought. Like, I wanted to be American. But my brother remembers specifically what he packed. Like, he had to go through his collection of little cars, and he was like, okay, I can only pick a few. I have to give the other ones away. I was 14, so toys wasn't really a thing for me. And how, like, emotional that was for him. So just different ways of looking at the same experience, I guess. He had a great time in high school because he didn't play sports. He was really intelligent. He was in AP classes, so he was around children, kids that were more educated, that knew where Brazil was, that, you know, that valued his perspective and differences. Just that.
Yeah.
Being.
As an educator, you know, now that you might have students who are in the same position as you or your brother, how do you see your role in being able to support them through that process?
Yeah, so I taught kindergarten for many years, and one of the things that we did every year, we had a Countries of the World song. And so I had this big world map, and we had this song, and they had to memorize all the countries of the world. And then we would do, like, fun facts about different places of the world. And that was sort of my thing. Like, if you meet someone that's different than you, don't see that as a wall, see it as an opportunity to learn more. And I will see some of these kids today when I'm at the grocery store and be like, Mrs. Moore, remember when we, learned about Ghana? Or, and it's like, guess what? I met somebody from, this country. Or, hey, I heard Madagascar in the movie, So just kind of like pique their curiosity towards outside of their bubble. That's always been my goal.
Yeah. So you had also mentioned, in our little conversation about DEI, about the importance of being able to share stories. You came out here today to be able to share your story with us. So what is something that you haven't shared already that, you feel is a part of your story that, you want preserved in these memories and in these interviews?
So I mentioned my mom was a single mom, and we lived in this 2-bedroom apartment with 8 of us. But when I was 7 years old, my mom got married, and my stepdad was a professional basketball player. But in Brazil, that didn't mean anything. Like, that was like playing lacrosse here. Like, it's not really that, at the time, especially in the 70s, basketball was not a very popular sport, but he was a professional basketball player, and he had 3 children from a previous marriage, and we all kind of became a blended, family. And so he was Black, and I had 3 siblings that were Black, and then my brother and I. And I think that's why when I moved here, I thought that it was so interesting that people would say, like, well, why is your dad Black? Because I was never asked that before moving here. But to say that Brazil, well, Rio de Janeiro in particular, even though can be a violent, sort of difficult place to navigate, it does have a lot of culture. And I do think that if people are willing to travel abroad, that they should visit Rio, because it is a really interesting place.
All right, before we wrap things up, I was going to ask, you speak a lot about learning about world history and how important it is. Was there a lot of involvement within Brazil in response to some of the global strife during like the 60s and 70s, let's say in Indonesia with Jakarta, or Vietnam and any of the world wars? Like, were you aware about those things?
Yeah, so my grandfather was in World War II with the Brazilian Navy. He was in a submarine, actually in I guess in the waters between South America and North America and in the Caribbean. And he talked a lot about that. He actually lied about his age to be able to join the military and be in World War II, because he wanted to be, an ally. He wanted to say, like, I was in World War II. There was a lot of, rebellion, especially so artists in Brazil were the ones that were like very rebellious, and they were able to represent their opinion by using art and music. So I do remember learning a lot about that. But yeah, because I wasn't alive in the 60s and the 70s, that's all I remember, was knowing that artists were allowed to express themselves, and lots of Brazilians had pride to be in part of World War II.
All right, well, thank you. Is there anything else that you would like to share? Maybe something that we missed, something that you feel like should be covered before we wrap things up?
I think you guys should give me a class on Latin American history, so I would know more.
Well, that's a good, actually, request for you to make. Basically, all I know is within the Dominican Republic, there was a terrible dictatorship involving Trujillo, and where I didn't know a whole lot about it because my mom did. I was more Americanized growing up.
Yeah.
She did mention a lot about, like you mentioned, with the differing perspectives. The Dominican Republic kind of treated him like a deity, despite, from an outside perspective, him being a terrible political ruler. So I definitely understand what you mean by the differing perspectives.
Yeah, no, similarly, I think that you echoed a lot of sentiments that are experienced in terms of how the U.S. covers issues that go on in Latin America, of how, sometimes they'll say kind of like, oh, this thing was terrible, nobody should support this person and things like that. And while that might be true to a certain degree, like JoAnn was saying, that that some dictators are, terrible, and that they had lasting consequences on these countries. For example, in Venezuela, there are people that were benefiting from those regimes and whatnot. So, those stories do differ very greatly based on who you talk to. Some people who lived in the city, might have had the greatest time or they had, associations with the government, so those experiences and those stories do create a different picture in totality than I think the U.S. does give credit to. So it is just very interesting to be able to talk to every person about their experiences to get a more holistic understanding of Latin American movements and histories. But yeah, I think that just about concludes our interview. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. It's been a pleasure. And yeah.
Thank you guys for studying Latin American history. I love it. I want to hang out with you guys.
That was nice.